Welcome to Let's Talk Near Death, the podcast show where we talk about life, death, and experiences somewhere in between. I'm Kirsty Salisbury, the host of the show, and join me as I talk to everyday people with not so everyday experiences. Let's talk near death. So joining me today, we've got Jeff O'Driscoll, who's based in Utah, and Jeff has an amazing story around a shared death experience that he was a part of. So Jeff, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be with you.
Can you start at the beginning? Tell us a little bit about this experience, what the circumstances were around it, and how this all took place.
Well, I'm an emergency physician. 25 years in a level 1 trauma center. I spent a lot of time seeing patients with a great number of illnesses and injuries. And on occasion, I saw people that had spiritual phenomena associated with them. And one of them, the one you're referring to, I think, is Jeff Olsen, who I can speak about because he's actually talked about his experience. He's published it, as a matter of fact. So I'm not disclosing any confidentialities to share this. He was involved in a serious car accident about 200 miles from my hospital. His car rolled over. It took the life of his wife and his 14-month-old son and injured him very badly. And he was extricated from the vehicle and taken to a local hospital where he was stabilized in some degree. And then he was flown to my facility where I was on duty in the emergency department. And in the trauma room, another team of professionals were taking care of him. We have more than one emergency physician at a time in the department, so I wasn't responsible for his medical care. But I did go into the trauma room, and as he lay motionless on the gurney, being cared for by a team of providers, above him in the air stood his deceased wife, who had just died in the car crash earlier that evening, and her body was still 200 miles away. Her physical body, that is, was 200 miles away in central Utah. And she communicated with me during that time. She expressed her profound gratitude for the care that her husband was receiving. And I walked over and looked at him and checked the pulse in his leg. I knew his leg was badly injured, and I knew he was going to lose his leg. And as I looked down at him on the gurney, I could still see her standing in the air behind me because I could see in all directions at the same time.
Oh, wow.
And there was this profound flow of knowledge. I knew who she was, who he was, even though I'd never met them. I knew that he'd live. I knew that there was purpose in his life going forward. And it was just this wonderful and profound experience. And then he went off to the operating room, and I went back out and finished my shift and went home, never expecting to see him again.
Wow. So when you walked into the room and you saw her standing in her spirit form above the bed, did that scare you? Were you afraid, or have you seen things like this before? Are you familiar with this type of experience?
I am familiar with these experiences. I've had a number of them, and it didn't startle me, but it was a wonderful experience, and it was more profound than some, and it was not frightening. It was engaging. It was enlivening and encouraging. And in my book, when I talk about some of these experiences, I refer to them as near-life experiences rather than near-death experiences.
I love
because
that.
It's been my experience that people feel closer to the profound and spiritual fullness of the life that they feel is theirs than at any other time during their mortal existence.
Yeah.
I didn't know that at the time I met Jeff, but when we got to know each other later, I learned that he'd had a near-death experience. Well, before his body was even extricated from the vehicle, he left his body, and he was above the scene of the accident in the air, and he communicated with his wife then. And he would say, and I've heard him say it many times, he felt more alive then. He felt that was more real than anything in his mortal life. And so I call these near-life experiences rather than near-death experiences.
Yeah, I absolutely love this term because it's a common theme that I hear from pretty much everybody who's had the near-death experience, as we call it. And they're saying that what they experience when they're away from this reality was so much more real than anything they've ever experienced on earth. So I totally agree. I love it. Love it.
Yes, and what I just described, actually, my own experience was what, as you mentioned, we'd call a shared death experience, where someone else is dying or near death, and a perfectly healthy person in the vicinity has some kind of a spiritual manifestation. And they're interesting and profound in that there's all kinds of theories about what causes near-death experiences from a medical perspective. As a physician, I'm familiar with some of these. And there's a discussion of an anoxic brain injury, or neurotransmitter release, or a temporal lobe seizure. None of these explanations really hold up to any kind of scientific scrutiny when they're tested. But regardless of all of that, how do you use any of those to explain a shared death experience? Because that person, i.e. me in this case, was perfectly alert, awake, healthy. I wasn't having a seizure. And I went out and finished the rest of my shift in the emergency department and went home. So it begs an answer of what's the phenomenon and how does it work?
Absolutely. I completely agree, because even myself, after my experience, I tried to put it into some explanation, some way of reasoning with it. But I think what you're saying, somebody who's fully bodied, fully able, completely alert, and just going about their normal day, if they can experience it, then it really does eliminate a lot of those reasons or things that we make up around the stories. So when you saw his wife and she was giving you some kind of information, she was saying thank you, but also you said that you could see all around you all at the same time. What was going through your mind?
Well, it's been my experience that these type of spiritual experiences are often difficult or impossible to have if my mind is consumed with things medical and physical. So, for example, if I'm in the trauma room and I'm running the trauma and I'm intubating the patient and I'm barking out orders and I'm trying to stop the bleeding and keep somebody alive, I rarely have a spiritual experience. But as in Jeff's case, if I walk into the department, into the trauma room, and somebody else is taking care of all of that stuff, and my mind is open and free, then sometimes I have these profound spiritual experiences. And so when you ask me what's going through my mind, I frankly wasn't thinking much about his medical condition because I didn't have to. I wasn't his doctor. And so when I saw her in the air, my mind was open to spiritual things. And as you've heard people describe in many of their near-death experiences, there's this profound flood of knowledge that comes into your mind. Yeah. And it's not forced upon you. It's like it's floating there freely in the ether, waiting for you to take it in if you wish. It comes easily and naturally to you, and you understand things, and it reprioritizes your life. You look at things differently. Suddenly, everybody's of equal worth. Suddenly, the only thing that matters is love and how you treat other people. And all the other insignificant things of life fade away, and you see what's important.
Absolutely. I've heard before people saying when people have an experience, they see people at a different age when they see them in spirit form. So perhaps that's when they're younger, or when they're at a time when they don't have illness in their body. What did she look like to you?
To me, she looked like she was at the perfect prime of her life.
Yeah.
And I've had experiences which quite contrasted that, because she was in the prime of her life at the time of her death, essentially. I suspect she looked about the age of that she was in her earthly existence. But on another occasion, for example, I walked into the emergency department at the beginning of my shift, and before I even logged into the computer, I felt a spiritual presence. And I felt this vibration, this tingling that starts in the core of my soul and spreads outward into my extremities and reverberates. And I know that means something different to everybody, but for me, that heralds a spiritual presence.
Yeah.
And I walked into the next room where this person was asking me for help. The person I'm referring to was an elderly woman who was unconscious on a gurney, and a team of providers were trying to resuscitate her. They were actually doing chest compressions. And she is silently, psychically communicating to me and asking me if it's okay to leave. And I want to make this explicitly clear again. I had absolutely no responsibility for medical care. This was a completely spiritual exchange we had. I walked over and inconspicuously rested my hand on her leg because I've learned that touch is so valuable and important in spiritual things. And as I did so, she asked me if it was okay to leave.
Yeah.
And I wondered, why would you ask me?
Yeah, I'm wondering that too. Yep.
Yes. And who am I? And why do you think that? Anyway, she asked me the question. And I thought for a minute, and then it felt like something came from some eternal place, and I communicated silently to her as the other providers were trying to resuscitate her. I said, if you feel like it's your time to go, and if you think it's okay, then I think it's probably okay.
Mm.
And she rose up out of her body and stood in the air and appeared to be about half the age of the body she'd just come out of.
Oh, wow.
And she was full of life and love and gratitude, and some glorious peace from her settled onto me for a time. And then she left. She thanked me, and then she left.
Oh, wow.
And I turned around and exited the room as everybody else continued to do what they were doing. I heard the physician call out a time in military terms and pronounce her dead. Of course, I knew she was dead because I'd seen her leave. And to this day, I don't know what, if anything, I did to help her, but I learned that it's important that we be willing. If we want to have spiritual experiences, we need to be willing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, in answer to your question, I've seen spirit beings who appeared to be in the prime of their life despite the way that their physical body looked. And I just talked with somebody this morning who had an encounter with their brother who died in infancy, and he came to them in his adult form 30 years later, and she recognized who he was even though he was an adult.
Oh, wow. Interesting, because you often hear of people being younger, but not necessarily older. Do you think that's a common thing where people will appear older?
I've spoken with many people who have seen spirits, and I think it varies. I think we really get into trouble when we try to cram things too much into a box and make them all the same. Because I've heard people have experiences in many regards. They've seen spirits as a child. They've seen spirits that were children when they died that came as an adult. And experiences like I had, where an elderly person, her spirit, when it left the body, appeared to be young again. And I think it depends on the spirit and the person they're coming to see and the purpose of the visit.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes sense to me. Yeah. Can you go back a little bit? You talked about how you saw Jeff's wife standing above the bed. You got this ability to see all around you. Then you got a download of information. You knew that he was going to survive, that she wasn't, that they'd already lost the other child. Was the child with her?
I did not see the child. I didn't experience the child. I just experienced her.
Yeah.
And I never expected to see Jeff again. I left the department, went home. I made a cursory note in my journal about an interesting experience and didn't say much more about it than that. And about a month later, a nurse who experienced it with me, I should mention that, a nurse came and got me and told me to come into the trauma room because she'd already seen his wife. And she was the only person in the department that knew I had spiritual experiences, and she'd had spiritual experiences. And so we kind of shared that bond. And she dragged me into the trauma room, and we experienced it together. And she came to me a month later and said, "We have to go see Jeff and tell him what happened."
Yeah,
and I said,
wow.
"Oh, no, we don't. We don't have to do that.
Really?
We don't have to do any such thing." I was not enthused about sharing my spiritual experiences with a perfect stranger. I didn't know he had a near-death experience. I didn't know anything about him.
But what was your resistance? Because surely that could help him in his healing or being able to manage without her. What was your resistance to talk to him about that?
Well, I didn't speak about any of my experiences for 20 years. And part of it, I had a sense that these things were sacred, maybe too sacred to talk about.
Sure.
I had a reluctance to speak to people that might not value them or honor them the way I did. Of course, there's always the possibility of being rejected and ridiculed. As you know, near-death experiencers often go 6-8 years before they ever talk about their experiences.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
And then, you're risking professional suicide as a physician talking about such things as well. And so I had that reluctance. And so for a lot of reasons, I wasn't inclined to go talk to him.
Yeah. So what happened when you did go talk to him? What was that like?
We went to see him, and the nurse came in and said, "We have to tell you something." And she sat down in a chair, and I kind of stood over in the corner because I'm kind of quiet and closed mouth about these things. And in fact, 20 years later, Jeff told me, he said, "Yeah, you stood in the corner and you didn't say much." And I thought, that's probably an accurate recollection. That sounds like me.
Yeah.
But I nodded occasionally to be polite and to progress the conversation along. And when it got to the point where she said I'd seen Tamara, I acknowledged, yeah, that's true. In fact, I was so closed mouth about it, I left him with the impression that I'd experienced or sensed her presence but not seen her. And he carried that misimpression for almost 20 years.
Ah, okay. Yeah.
And as he and this nurse were talking, Spirit spoke to me, and I understood that he and I would be good friends for decades into the future, and that he would have important things to do in this life, and that we would do some things together. And that all came to me as I was listening to them talk.
Yeah. And was he quite open to share about his experience? Because this is early on, isn't it? He's still in the hospital after his accident.
Yes, this was just a month after his accident, and he was still in the hospital. He'd had some surgeries by then. I think he'd had his leg amputated by then. And he was a bit, he had some trepidation about sharing as well. He was reluctant, but he felt that there was some safety there as we moved along in the conversation until he started to share a bit. But we didn't have a real conversation about his near-death experience for a few more months after that. Then we had some real heart-to-heart conversations a few months later after he got out of the hospital.
So how did that friendship begin from visiting him in hospital and telling him what you had experienced, or what actually he didn't really understand, did he? So how did it go from there, from visiting him and then becoming friends with him?
Well, I went to see him a few months after his accident, and by that time he was well enough to be out of the hospital briefly, but not well enough to go home. He was staying at his brother's house for a time. And I went to his brother's house to see him. And we had this long conversation. It was more involved than he even recalled. Until I told him what I'd written in my journal about it, he thought he'd never told me some of the things that he'd shared and that I had heard. And he was really struggling to integrate some of his experience into his belief system that he'd been told all his life. Some things didn't seem to jive quite right, and he was struggling with that. And I'd had enough experiences by then, some of them really wrenching, difficult experiences, and some of them very spiritual experiences, but I'd had enough that I could help him. And the thing that really, I think, moved our friendship forward to the next step was the fact that I went home that night after our first real visit, and I wrote in my journal, for the first time I was grateful for the horrible experiences I'd had because I knew how to help him, and I knew the answers to his questions. And that's what started us healing together.
Yeah. That's beautiful, isn't it? That you can pull that out and then put that in where it's needed. And so going forward, you guys have remained really good friends. And is he doing okay today?
He's doing great. Yes,
we
just spent a few hours together a couple days ago and had a nice chat. We see each other a few times a month, have lunch or something, and keep in touch through text messaging and phone calls and such. We have a good friendship. I mean, that's what's really rare and unusual.
Yeah.
He was invited to be on a television program about 10 years ago. This is while I was still in the proverbial spiritual closet, right? I hadn't come out to talk about any of my experiences yet. And the producer of the TV show wanted him to come on, and they wanted a doctor to testify about how badly he was injured and how near dead he was.
Yeah.
I.e. me. They wanted me to come. And I told Jeff, I said, if that's their focus, they've already missed the boat.
Yeah.
Because the real story isn't how dead were you or how long were you dead or the debate of the medical definition of death. The real story is, where did you go? What did you learn? And how has it changed your life now?
Mm.
And the real miracle is that I walked into the trauma room and saw his wife, and that he and I are still good friends. Those are the things that we ought to be talking about.
Yeah. Why do you think that is? Why do you think people obsess so much about proving that somebody was dead? I hear this a lot with, people say, well, was that person clinically dead? Is it on their medical reports? All of these questions around it. Why do you think there's that need to prove that we're actually dead?
People want some kind of an explanation for something they can't explain.
Yeah.
And there's good data now. There's a lot of cases. Some of the most prominent near-death experiencers now were not ever declared clinically dead.
Mm.
And so there's a movement a little bit away from that notion that you have to be absent a heartbeat and absent brain activity and be declared dead to have a legitimate near-death experience. Most of the people that have the most profound experiences were never declared dead. That's not what it's about. In my opinion, what it's about is, did you leave your body?
Mm.
And did your consciousness or your soul or your spirit, does it exist independent of your body?
Mm.
For many years, for example, Eben Alexander, a Harvard-trained neurosurgeon, was a materialist and contended that the mind existed because of the brain, that the brain generated the consciousness.
Mm.
And after he had a rare form of bacterial meningitis and was in a coma for a week, when he'd recovered enough to study his own medical records, he concluded that his brain was far too sick to generate the experience he had while his body was in a coma. And now he is an avid proponent of non-local consciousness, that the consciousness exists in spite of the brain, not because of it.
Mm. Mm. And we're hearing this more and more, aren't we? I think there's a really big rise of awareness of spiritually transformation experiences, for out-of-body experiences, all of these types of things. Most of that probably comes down to the fact that we've got the internet and now people are sharing them publicly and we're hearing about them a lot more often. But I think there's such a rise in awareness of the spiritual connection to something greater than us and how we aren't simply our body. Mm.
Yeah, I agree. Almost inevitably, near-death experiencers and shared death experiencers, for that matter, have an encounter with something that they believe to be divine.
Yeah.
Or greater than themselves, at least. And they feel that connection, and some of them call it God, some of them call it Christ, or some other divine being. Sometimes it depends a bit on their cultural background, but there's some uniformities across most cultures and religions.
Mm.
And one of the things that they almost universally come back with, too, is a sense that they are themselves divine, that they have a divine origin and nature.
Yeah. Yeah. And that happened for me as well. That's exactly what I came back with, is that there is a connection. It's not about a divine being and we are separated, that we are all connected. We are all part of something together. Yeah.
I agree. And I had that experience myself on more than one occasion.
So can we talk about some of these experiences? As a doctor, you must have seen so many things in your time. You talked about how you were in your spiritual closet, so to say, about how you weren't necessarily open and talking about these experiences that you were having. Was the shared death experience the opening for this, or are you happy to share a little bit about that process and that journey, some of the other things that you've experienced or things that you've witnessed?
I never thought about those things for years until I finally started to share. And one day I woke up and for some reason it felt okay to share some of my experiences. And I started to do so in a very cautious way and safe environments. And people invariably came up to me and asked me that question: when did this start and how did this start for you?
Yeah.
And for me, it was just part of my life. So I had never given that much thought, but their questions forced me to think about it. And when I thought about it and contemplated and went back in my life in time, I think it began when I was 11, when my 15-year-old brother was killed in a farm accident.
Oh.
We were very close, and he tipped a tractor over and he died. And in retrospect now, I see that this had some profound changes on my life. I thought I got through it unscathed, actually. I thought that I really wasn't impacted that much. And then 20 years later, my brother came to me and he said, you need to go talk to our mother because there's things she's never told you about my death.
Yep.
And I went and spoke with my mother. And she told me that day that she'd always known where I was in the house before my brother's death because she could hear me singing. And when my brother Stan died, she said I stopped singing.
Oh, no.
So it must have had a real deep impact on me, more than I realized.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of what opened the door for my experiences. And then I continued to have experiences during my teenage years, even though I was doing a lot of things that might not seem conducive with spirituality. I'd still get messages and voices sometimes. In fact, once when I was 16, I was driving a small car at high speed on a narrow, windy road after dark with two friends in the car, none of us wearing seat belts. And this voice said to me, you need to slow down. And for some reason, I listened. And
Were
I
you
put my
familiar
foot
with this
on the
voice?
brake. Pardon?
Were you familiar with this voice?
I didn't recognize it at the time. It was just a voice, but it wrapped itself around my heart, and it was part of me. And I slowed down, and we went around the corner and met a pair of headlights that belonged to a large Cadillac and hit head on. There was a lot of damage, but nobody was injured. And I think there's a good possibility that if I hadn't slowed down, I might have died that night.
Yeah.
And in retrospect, I thought about that, and I thought, I wouldn't have listened to my parents. I wouldn't have listened to any authority figure. And in that stage of my life, I don't think I'd have listened to God. If a divine being was sitting in the car next to me and speaking to me, I'm not sure I'd have listened. But I know one voice I'd have listened to, and it was my older brother, because I always listened to him.
So was it his voice that told you to slow down?
I think so.
Yeah.
I didn't recognize it at the time, but I think that's who it was.
Yeah, wow. And do you still have contact with him? Is he still visiting, or how's that going now?
I do. I do. He comes to me periodically. The last chapter of my book, as I'm writing the last lines of my book, he came. I didn't know who he was. I felt this spiritual presence. It was so powerful and so sustained, it made me weep. And I finally asked, I said, who are you? And he said, I'm your brother. I said, what do you want me to do? And he said, keep going.
Oh, great.
Yeah. And at the moment, I thought he was talking about my book.
Yeah.
But then I realized I was literally writing the last two sentences of the book. I record this experience in my book. I wrote it as I was having it because I was writing the last chapter of the book.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And I thought he meant the book. And then it dawned on me, no, the book's all done. And then something interesting happened. I had a stack of books fresh off the press. I stuck them in my bag. I went to the airport. I was going to my first organized speaking engagement. And in the airport, this couple sat down next to me and started asking me about where I was going and what I was doing. And when I told them, this young woman looked at me and her eyes just brightened up and she said, my grandfather just died. And he's come to me a couple of times.
Oh.
And I was stunned by the fact that we just met and she's telling me this stuff, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But she had this sense that she was speaking to a believer and that I would listen to her. And it was so liberating for her.
Yeah.
And I asked her, I said, did you ask him what he wanted you to do? And she just resonated. She knew that was the right question somehow. And she took one of my books and she and her husband went and caught their plane. And I got on my plane to go to Boston on the other side of the country. And I'd been an emergency physician for 25 years at that point. I estimated in excess of 60,000 patients by then.
Whoa,
And
that's a
on
lot.
the plane, going to Boston, this voice that I've come to trust spoke to me and said, "You will help more people with this book than you helped as a physician in the emergency department."
Oh, wow. That's amazing. Do you think that's happened? It's hard to tell, isn't it?
It's in progress.
Yeah.
It's beginning to happen. And I think that's what my brother was talking about when he said, keep going.
Yeah.
I think he meant keep talking, keep sharing, keep teaching, keep going.
Yeah, I'd say so. Tell us about this book, Jeff. Have you got a copy there that you can show us?
I do.
Okay, show
I've
us
done a
this
few
book.
podcasts now, and I've gotten to the point where people ask me the book, so I've learned to bring one with me.
Yeah.
So this is the book. It's titled Not Yet. The title comes from a very poignant experience I had that's recorded in the book. It's available in print or Kindle on Amazon. And it starts out in large measure with the night I met Jeff Olsen.
Yeah.
And then it gives a little bit of context around that. And then much of it is the first year of our friendship and the profound spiritual experiences I had during that year after meeting Jeff. And it talks about some of my experiences in the emergency department, some of my spiritual experiences that were outside the emergency department, and the things I've learned from it. You'll see the subtitle of the book, Near Life Experiences and Lessons Learned.
Mm.
So, and the foreword's by Jeff Olsen.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Okay. Jeff, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Thank you for coming on and sharing your experience and a little bit more of the back scenes around your time in the wards and your time in the hospitals and the things that you've seen. Is there one thing that you would say stands out to you over everything that you've experienced? One key message or something that you feel to share?
There is something that's important and profound, and I think that it's so obvious that people miss it sometimes, and that's this: believe. I have met with so many people who start out telling me about their spiritual experiences, and they begin by telling me what they didn't experience. They'll say, "I didn't see anyone, I just knew they were there." Or they'll say, "I didn't actually hear a voice, I just felt it."
Yeah.
And they say it as though feeling and knowing were somehow a consolation prize, not realizing that those are the senses of the spirit. So when you feel something, when you know it in your soul, believe it. That's one of the things I learned from my many encounters with spiritual beings.
Jeff, thank you very much. I encourage all of our listeners and our viewers to go and get a copy of this book. I can't wait to read it myself. Sounds absolutely incredible. Thank you for your time and sharing your story. This has been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been wonderful being with you.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Let's Talk Near Death podcast show. If you've enjoyed it, please share it with your friends, tell people about it. I'd love to get these messages out there. You can also connect with me on Facebook at Kirsty Salisbury Official, and you can subscribe to receive updates for new episodes as they come about. I'm Kirsty Salisbury, and this is Let's Talk Near Death.